Happy Halloween, everyone! If you're reading Halloween books, it's an appropriate time. I'm not, but I am going to talk about the books that I have been reading this month. Before we get into that though, I just want to say if any of you have any questions, I'll be doing a Q&A video very soon, so if you have any questions about books or anything else, feel free to ask them in the comments section and I will answer them very soon. But now let's get on to the books that I have been reading this month. And firstly, I want to talk about a series of essays I've been reading. So those of you who have been on the channel for a while know that I quite like the cultural critic Camille Paglia. I think her book Sexual Personae is a wonderful book, worth reading if you want to get a really deep and broad overview of not just world literature but world art as well. And in this book, it's I want to say third or second essay collection. It's called Vamps and Tramps, and it's basically a collection of interviews that she did or articles, and I've been slowly working my way through. As is typical, there are some outrageous Paglia moments in Vamps and Tramps, especially when we are focusing on the documentaries that she did and some of the talk shows that she did and the scripts for them. She says some pretty outlandish things. The first essay that I enjoyed was called No Law in the Arena, which is Paglia at probably her most controversial. She talks about the difference between the private realm and the public realm and how she thinks that sexual politics should be mediated between these two realms. But the essay that really struck me was one that I really wasn't expecting. It's this collection of four essays that she did on four of her close friends, who all happen to be gay men, some of whom died during the AIDS epidemic. And you see a side of Paglia in these essays that's just incredibly personal that you just don't really see very often, because Paglia typically she's focusing on the issues that she's talking about, and she might mention occasionally like her background and her family life, but generally she's focusing on the issues at hand. So in these essays, it's interesting to see not just a more personal side of Paglia as she's describing these great friends and how they inspired her, and she's talking about particular events in their lives, but also a softer side, especially with some of the men who were suffering. She talks about one of them who was basically just, not wanting to openly admit that he was dying of AIDS, and she had a few conversations with him, and it's really heartfelt stuff that you don't really see from Paglia that often. So if you are a fan of Paglia and you haven't read this collection, I would recommend it just to see that side of her. Also, the way she describes these people, it's much more like biography than it is literary or art criticism, of course. And it makes me think it would have been amazing if she'd have actually written an autobiography, perhaps, or even just a novel, because she just has such a great way with words, a great way of describing people. And usually that's just reserved for her quips and her jibes at other academics and her various enemies. But when she's using it in this way, when she's describing these characters from her life and her upbringing and her time at university with these men, or school in some cases, it's just a whole side to her talent that I hadn't seen before. So I'm enjoying Vamps and Tramps a lot. Some of the essays are a little bit out there, let's just say, but I really appreciated that one, and like I say, I would recommend reading it if you haven't. The next two things on the list are two Shakespeare plays. Firstly, Henry IV Part 2, which I watched with my partner, watching these BBC adaptations, and it was a good play. I liked it a lot. In this play we have a continuation of Prince Hal's story in his relationship with Falstaff, but interestingly in this play we see Hal moving away from Falstaff. He's no longer sort of hanging around with Falstaff a lot. They only have one proper scene together, and then we get them coming together at the end, but only for Hal to very cruelly and coldly reject Falstaff. And it's a very strange play for that. I didn't expect that to happen. I knew that Hal would ultimately reject Falstaff. I knew that already going in, but I didn't realise how little time they would spend together. And in fact, I felt like it called a lot of questions when it comes to Hal's character. He comes across as quite cold and calculating in this play, as if he never really cared about Falstaff to begin with. It wasn't the kind of story where we had them close at the beginning and slowly drifting apart. There's always this sort of undertone of psychopathy even, or at least sociopathy, to Hal. And this also came out in the first part as well. In part one, there's this bit where Falstaff and Hal are essentially parodying each other, and they do a bit of back and forth. But when Falstaff does it, at least in the production that I watched, it's clear that Falstaff is joking, and he's sort of playfully mocking the prince and his father, and even himself. Whereas when Hal does the mockery of Falstaff, it comes across a lot more sincere and cutting and dark. And so in a way it's not very surprising that Hal ultimately rejects Falstaff, but it does give this sort of dark edge to his character that I think is very interesting and worth exploring. I'm also enjoying the fact that these two Shakespeare history plays, unlike his other ones, are very much focused on character. It really is about Falstaff in particular, but also Hal. And we do get the background figure of Henry IV as well. It's kind of strange in a way that Henry IV, although the plays are named after him, he is really a background figure in both. He comes up a lot more in the second half of the play. We start to get him, he's wasting away in this play, slowly dying, and he has a pretty good speech about power. There's a point where Hal thinks his father is dead and so just takes his crown and puts it on, and then his father wakes up and is furious that, because from his point of view his son just stole the crown from his head before he even died. And they have a great moment together where they call each other out, and it's funny because Henry IV is also a bit of a hypocrite because he did also usurp the crown himself, so to chastise his son for not really usurping the crown but just taking it because he thought his father was dead is a little bit hypocritical. It's an interesting play. Of course, I continued reading my Harold Bloom essays along with it, and Bloom really enjoys this play. He's very down on Hal as a character, and he actually helped me see a lot of those dark undertones to Hal's character, which I appreciated. And he is a big believer in Falstaff, the character. He thinks that he's one of Shakespeare's greats, and I definitely agree. In fact, I've often said this, with Shakespeare comedies, I find it's quite hard for a lot of the humour to land. You need a really good actor to get the humour landing in a Shakespearean comedy, and the guy who played Falstaff really did that. There's this great speech in this play that's just basically Falstaff giving an ode to to drink, which is hilarious. And there are loads of other great Falstaff moments as well, like when his sort of lover, this woman who owns an inn, she comes into the play and she's distraught because he has promised to marry her and he's eaten her out of house and home and used her for her money. And they have this hilarious back and forth where he's trying to, placate her to the guy who she's reporting him to. So some great moments from Falstaff, some great humour, but also a lot of other things in the play as well. The weight of the crown is obviously a big theme, but also this ambiguous relationship between Falstaff and Hal, which I really enjoyed. The next play that I want to talk about is Othello, which I saw at the RSC, Royal Shakespeare Company, and it was thankfully, a standard production. The cast were aged up, which actually worked perfectly fine, I thought. It was interesting to see Desdemona in particular as played by a slightly older woman, but it worked really well, and in fact she gave a certain kind of defiant maturity to Desdemona, which, if you read Shakespeare, Desdemona is not only young but comes across as a very sort of pure, innocent, unworldly person even at times, whereas the Desdemona that we got in this production had a little bit more gravitas, which I quite liked. But aside from the aging up slightly of some of the characters, the actual production itself was pretty standard fare in terms of, no annoying allusions to modern times. People aren't, wearing hoodies and tracksuit bottoms, and Othello's like, I don't know, just a thug or something, I have no idea. But there was none of that, which I appreciate, because as someone who really doesn't like modernising Shakespeare adaptations, I'm just there for the story, the text. I don't really want to be distracted by directors shoehorning in things that are ultimately less interesting to me than the original texts. And I thought that the actors themselves did a great job of bringing the play to life. I'm familiar with Othello, I studied it in school. I think it's a really great play. The guy who played Iago, he was a bit off, he was a bit quiet, and so sometimes it was hard to hear some of the best speeches, which was a shame. But the man who played Othello was absolutely amazing, as was Desdemona. And also Amelia, she had some nice moments as she got into the play. So it was a really, really good production. I like Othello a lot, so something that hopefully I will read as well again at some point in the future. And I'm looking forward to seeing, when I get to watching it through these BBC adaptations I've been watching, how it compares to that production, because I thought that production was really good. And one thing that I like about watching lots of Shakespeare plays, especially when they don't have gimmicks to differentiate them, is you can sort of just appreciate how they differ, how a different actor might take on the role, or someone might be played more sympathetically. In fact, this Othello was a lot softer than the Othello that I've seen in the past in the film version by Kenneth Branagh. So that was an interesting take, just to sort of give him this softer side. Ultimately, though, he's not soft because he kills Desdemona, but that isn't always an interesting thing, and it's something that I quite like in Shakespeare plays, those more subtle changes in production, rather than just having it in modern times so that young people can relate to it or whatever, which for me, not for that. Next, I want to talk about my continuation of Lord of the Rings. I had just started reading The Fellowship of the Ring when I had my last reading vlog, and as I said, I was starting to really get into it in a way that I just didn't expect, because I remember reading The Hobbit when I was maybe 14, and I think I got to about the giants, or is it trolls or giants? I forget. No, it's trolls. And I think it was around that bit that I stopped reading. Not because I was bored, it was just other things came up and nothing drew me back into the book. And then that happened again when I picked up The Lord of the Rings a few years ago. I read the whole Fellowship of the Ring, I read a bit of The Two Towers, and again just petered out. Other things got in the way and I never went back to it because I didn't have that urge. Now I'm reading or listening to an audiobook, which is, I think, spoken by the man who plays Gollum in the films. He's a wonderful job at narration and voice acting, bringing all the characters to life, and really bringing the language to life as well. I'll say it 1,000 times, but when you have an amazing literary work and an amazing voice actor that can really do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to getting into older texts, and for me that's worked wonders with Tolkien. I've been really enjoying this first book, the whole thing, the sort of even digging into some of the metaphors and things, this idea of England as this sort of place of mythology and the forests and magic, and this slowly being eroded by a dark force. Obviously there's some analogy here being made to the World War, and I think that's a really sad aspect, a sadness that I didn't really get when I read it for the first time, this idea that not only is this darkness coming, but when we get to the elves and they acknowledge that if they destroy the ring, it comes at this great cost, which is the loss of this magical world, but they have to make that sacrifice. I think that's a really powerful message, and a lot of the times, to compare it to something like Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, because they're on the mind at the moment, the end of her novels, it's a very happy ending, and we get the happy ending with very little cost to the protagonist, and that's nice, but it is also not very realistic. Oftentimes good things do come at a cost, and Tolkien really recognises this in a deep sense. He recognises that yes, they might be able to defeat the Dark Lord, but it will come at the cost of this loss of that magical world that was. And so I'm really enjoying picking into and digging into those metaphors. I haven't started reading The Two Towers because I actually cancelled my Audible subscription until December, but once December kicks around, I will get another credit and I'll start listening to the next book. I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope that my enthusiasm continues for the remaining 2 books, and I'll definitely be doing a video talking about my deeper thoughts on these books as well, so look out for those. And the last thing that I've been reading, almost done now, it's a big book because it's Dickens and his books are often quite long. We're on Barnaby Rudge, a book that, similarly to Lord of the Rings, I did struggle with initially. I think I read the first few chapters, gave up, went back, started again, and now I'm reading it much faster. I'm near the end now, and it's a book that I am unsure of because it has its moments. It has some very bizarre fun bits, like the character of the Raven that's incredibly charismatic and silly. Barnaby Rudge himself, the simple child with some kind of learning, well, not just learning difficulty, but cognitive difficulty, is a new kind of protagonist for Dickens. We have had vulnerable children before in Dickens with Oliver Twist and with Nell, and then we had the sort of powerful, everyman that we got with Nicholas Nickleby. And with Barnaby, it's just something different because he obviously is an innocent to a point, but he also does go down some dark places because of his impairments. He's not necessarily conscious of recognising what he's doing. He just gets caught up in these riots and he ends up in prison at one point. And you really feel for him, even though he's doing things that aren't great, because he's easily manipulated. So he's a very interesting figure. Another interesting thing about Barnaby Rudge as a book is that it's really the first proper break for Dickens in a lot of ways, because now he's writing a historical novel, one of two, the next one being obviously A Tale of Two Cities, but also it's not got that same episodic feeling that earlier books had, that Nicholas Nickleby had especially, and The Old Curiosity Shop, and even Oliver Twist. Oliver Twist is a bit more like a novel, but it does still have, sort of Oliver in various adventures. Whereas Barnaby Rudge, it feels more like a systematic novel, but then it also has this very jarring break partway through. So it sort of builds itself up as a sort of murder mystery, which, as I said in my last discussion, I really enjoyed that. Sort of, you've got this Maypole Inn, where once upon a time there was a terrible murder or whatever, and then you've got these two strange figures in the bar, and then there's a attempted murder that happens later that night, and so you have all of this sort of stuff building up, people with secrets. Obviously got Dickens' comic characters as well, but then we go from this stuff to a kind of family love drama, which is fine. It's kind of standard fare for Dickens. He always has the sort of young lovers prancing around. He enjoys that, and then we have this complete transition from this plot to these riots. And initially, when this transition happened, before the riots kick off, I was starting to get really bored with the novel, because there was stuff and characters that I'd invested in that just vanish, and some of them haven't even come back yet. I'm starting to wonder if they even will. I hope they will. I have suspicions that one of them might, but Dickens just hasn't named them, but we'll see. And so it just felt completely like the novel was running away with itself. But then when the riots actually began in earnest, Dickens writes some of his most brutal, dark scenes. There's a scene at one point where burning hot lead falls on the top of someone's head, kind of like Game of Thrones, when the gold goes on top of is it Viserys? I'm going to say Viserys, when it goes on top of his head. That kind of thing, completely horrific, as these people, this mob just completely goes crazy, and they just demolish everything, they burn everything down, and there's just some really grisly, gruesome scenes in the course of this. Dickens had a real, flair with words in general, but he really does, when he wants to, he can really get there when it comes to horror and grisly things, and really getting into the weeds of all that. So actually I ended up enjoying the book again once the riots got going, and now we're sort of on the back end of the riots. Some of the characters have been swept up in them, some of them have lost their homes, some of them have lost family members and are now looking for them, and so we're slowly going to get to the resolution, I assume. So it's an inconsistent book. I can see why at the time it was sort of I think it was seen as Dickens' first proper flop, after the real highs of The Old Curiosity Shop in particular. I think Nicholas Nickleby was also very successful. I think The Old Curiosity Shop was probably his most successful, or at least in terms of his earlier novels. Maybe The Pickwick Papers, that also sold very well. But in any case, Barnaby Rudge, I think it was the one where it did sort of drop off. It also had a very long gestation period. I think it was actually supposed to be quite early written for Dickens, but he wouldn't do it for his publishers, and I think he bought the rights to himself and published it elsewhere, and so that I think the signs of that do maybe show a little bit in the book, but nevertheless it is interesting, and starting to see Dickens emerge as a more structured novelist to some degree, moving more away from the episodic thing, focusing on historical writing, which is new for him. Again, there's just lots of interesting things going on in this book. I don't know if it will be my ultimate favourite Dickens, but it's an underrated one, and if you haven't read it, I think even though I haven't finished it yet, I've almost finished, so I can quietly confidently say that I would recommend it. And that's it for this reading vlog. Do let me know down in the comments what books you've been reading this Halloween, and as I said, if you have any questions for the Q&A, drop those down in the comments as well. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra.